Thanks so much for the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon about sovereign industrial capabilities. It's a topic that engages the national consciousness about what sovereignty is, and people think about it in many different ways, from the nation and nation building right through to those fundamental defence capabilities. And that's the sort of framework that we're operating in now, is trying to outline a policy that is clear and actionable and focused on defence's capability needs fundamentally. The government has a very broad-based defence industry policy, and that policy is about building sovereignty, about building industry capability across the board. But this policy has to be very specific about defence sovereignty, the defence mission, and what we fundamentally need within the industrial base. It will always be a small subset that we manage and support, but that won't be at the detriment of our wider defence industry and defence industry policy objectives. Next slide, please. We started thinking about sovereign industrial capabilities as part of the 2016 Defence Industry Policy Statement. It was a pretty broad-based approach, though. It talked about transitioning from the priority industry capabilities and the strategic industry capabilities. That was a policy that came in around 2007, 2008, but it wasn't really refreshed and updated. And so you didn't have those clear links maintained to defence strategy. And as circumstances changed, the policy couldn't keep up necessarily with where defence was going. And so the focus in the Defence Industry Policy Statement was we need a more strategy-aligned framework, and we need to manage it strategically across defence and at a project level. So something that doesn't just exist in industry support, it exists across that framework fundamentally in force design, how we think about the defence industrial base and what we want it to be and what is fundamental within it to deliver the defence mission both today and in the future. And so that's where it started from, but it was very broad. It identified those sovereign industrial capabilities as those things really related to achieving the defence mission, where because if overseas sources don't provide the necessary assurance, capability, readiness that we need. And again, that was a pretty broad-based statement, and so we've looked at that and refined it, and we certainly have focused, and I think you'll see in the Defence Industrial Capability Plan that will be released by the end of this year, a bit more clarity and definition around preparedness and operations, achievability and affordability to try and really refine this policy down. The Defence Industry Policy Statement also included 6 assessment criteria. It didn't go into any detail about what those criteria could be defined as. It was very much a statement that we would look at those 6 criteria. And so as part of this policy development, we filled them out and tried to give some specificity to them. We've got to bound this policy. It's got to be practical and actionable, and it's got to be realistic, and that's what we've tried to do, and that's what you'll see in the Defence Industrial Capability Plan, which comes out by the end of this year. Next slide, please. I think that there is a debate and a real active sort of dialogue about sovereignty and what it means in the defence context. We see many people talk about industry of itself as being part of that sovereignty and where we build industry capability. But what we've tried to do in this policy is really set it out. In this policy, we're not going to resolve all of the nation's industry issues. We're not going to look at fuel security for the nation or energy. In this first instance, we're going to focus very much on the defence core mission, the warfighting mission, and what we need to achieve that mission. And so there's really that hierarchy from defence sovereignty, what defence must be able to do, and therefore in the industrial space, what industrial capabilities and outcomes we must be able to achieve for that purpose. There are different levels of industrial sovereignty. We know we talk about a sovereign naval shipbuilding industry and infrastructure, and of course they are enablers of that industrial and defence sovereignty we're seeking. And there are many capabilities, manufacturing capabilities, industrial capabilities that together make up the overall industrial outcomes that we're looking for. But we're trying to really refine it to something that is practical and allows us to do something about it. And that's the key. We are doing so much across the defence industry policy space. We've got the Australian Industry Capability Program. We've got massive opportunities for defence industry. This is not about all of those opportunities. It's really trying to refine it down. Next slide, please. And so these sort of principles that are on the slide are the ones that we've really looked hard at in framing the policy. We know that irrespective of our national ambitions, our objectives, that we are always going to be reliant on international sources for a range of major platforms and systems. We've made choices about the kind of force that we'll have in the long term, and that was very clear in the Integrated Investment Program. And so when we think about sovereignty, we have to define it within those parameters about those independent capabilities that we need. We have to really prioritise. As I said, there are so many other initiatives that we'll have in play to support defence industry to provide opportunity, and then we need to be very clear about what our absolute priorities are. And one of the challenges we faced is how do we make it clear enough and actionable enough that people understand what these sovereign industrial capabilities are. It's not going to be a set of companies, nor is it going to be very broad-based industrial capabilities that anyone could be part of. It's not going to be our defence industry. It's also going to evolve over time. One of the critical elements of this policy is that it has to be fundamentally linked to the force design cycle. That cycle will tell us issues and gaps and opportunities, and we have to keep up with the technology cycle as well. And so this is really a first baseline iteration. And it is really that critical element, particularly compared to the priority industry capabilities, where we have to manage it across defence. We have to know enough about these industrial capabilities, and we have to ensure that they're considered as part of decision-making from force design to capability life cycle, Australian industry capability, and the other levers we have for industry support. So a much more strategic approach than defence has ever taken in the past. That's challenging, but it's also exciting in terms of thinking about how we're going to do business in the future, and certainly how we're going to do business starting off from later this year. And I think we'll see full implementation and establishment of this new policy and all of its elements by about mid-next year. Next slide, please. So to give you some sense of the journey we've been on, I mean, you have to frame sovereign industrial capabilities deeply in defence strategy, the Defence White Paper and Defence Planning Guidance about what defence must be able to achieve and the priorities today about how and where and when it needs to achieve that. That is what drives our defence capability, it's what drives our sovereign industrial capability. And we looked across those assessment criteria and we looked across the capability programs in the Integrated Investment Program because they give a full sense of the force of defence capability. And from that, we made some decisions to refine what might be a list, and we've kept refining down because you have to get to a level of specificity within a broad base of an industrial capability. What is it that matters most? What is it that is fundamental? If it's not there when we need it, then the defence mission could suffer that we might fail. And so taking that quite a ruthless approach. And so what I think you'll see announced in the next few months is about a handful of initial sovereign industrial capabilities. They will be clearly defined, but they won't be specific companies. They will give a sense of a broad base of the industrial outcome we need, how we're going to deliver it, and looking at opportunities where industry might want to focus some effort. But this is not about picking winners. It is not going to be attached with hundreds of millions of dollars of funding. It is going to be quite small and discreet and focused on servicing that defence mission. And so we're now at that point of really finalising the scale and scope of the sovereign industrial capabilities and the implementation plan. And that's the key. Compared to the priority industry capabilities is something that's living and breathing and iterative, that will change according to what's happening in the world around us, where we see technology moving very quickly. It is going to be a living part of defence, and I think it's going to be a really critical part of force design, which itself in what it's doing is setting that really clear and exciting framework for defence capability. Next slide, please. And so when I talk about it, managing it as a system, that's what's going to be really different. We're going to think about and do our work around sovereign industrial capabilities managed by our Defence Industry Policy Division at all of those levels. One of the areas that we are weak and we have more work to do is to really have a clear sense of the defence industrial base in Australia. We've seen that in developing the first Defence Industrial Capability Plan, that you can't look back 2 years or 5 years or 10 years and say, that's what defence industry was. We can say now what our goals are, what our 10-year goals for defence industry that you'll see in the Defence Industrial Capability Plan, but we have to get better at understanding the industrial base at a quite tactical level. And so that will be critical to how we manage these sovereign industrial capabilities. Because in order to affect decisions, in order to affect force design, in order to look at the programming of the Integrated Investment Program, look at the health, the vulnerabilities, the opportunities within the Australian industrial base, you have to have that deep knowledge. but we have to be able to be practical and reasonable at how we're going to support those decisions. There are things that we can do quite immediately. We have the Australian Industry Capability Plans that already look at priority industry capabilities, and that's a fairly easy transition with guidance. We have the critical work of the Centre for Defence Industrial Capability, and that will be an easy transition. We will look at things like the Defence Innovation Hub, the Next Generation Technologies Fund, and where we can use and leverage those elements to support the sovereign industrial capabilities, where it makes sense to. And so it is going to be very much a strategic approach and an industry-focused approach as well. We'll be engaging regularly, we'll be having those discussions. We're not going to be doing every 2 years broad-based health checks. This is going to be far more iterative on a daily basis, understanding, having that knowledge and being able to support decisions. We're not going to come and go every few years. It's going to be very much a living approach. And of course, it has to be living because it has to move forward and it has to change. And so you may see within 2 years or 4 years or 6 years, different approaches as technology changes. So that's the broad base. As I said, to be released with the Defence Industrial Capability Plan by the end of this year, probably around a handful or so, and they have to be self-evident. They have to describe those fundamental elements of defence industry where, for sovereignty reasons, we must have an independent capability. But they're not going to be everything, and I'm sure people will have different views about what they are and why we've chosen certain things. But that is just the starting point. It is very much going to be something that lives with us and we evolve over time. That's all I wanted to say, but obviously very happy to take any questions if there's time, or come back with the panel.